3 houses on my street burned down that day. Mine didn't. And the only difference between me and my neighbors wasn't luck. It wasn't location. It wasn't the fire department showing up in time because they didn't. The only difference was water. I had it. They didn't. I want to tell you exactly how that happened. Because what I'm about to share isn't a survival tip you'll find on Reddit. It's not a product review. It's not a prepper fantasy. It's what actually happened to a regular family in a regular neighborhood when the system that was supposed to protect us completely failed. And I think it's going to change the way you think about water forever. The fire started around midday. The sky turned that particular shade of orange that doesn't look real, like someone put a filter over the whole world. The air smelled like burning wood and something chemical, something that made your eyes water even indoors. By the time the alerts started going off on our phones, the ridge 2 miles away was already completely engulfed. We've had fire seasons before. Every Californian has. You get the alerts, you get nervous, you watch the news, and most of the time it passes. Most of the time the wind shifts. Most of the time someone else's neighborhood takes the hit, and you feel guilty about your relief. This time was different. Within 40 minutes, the fire had jumped the main road. People were loading their cars in the middle of the street. Dogs were running loose. Someone's horse was galloping down the bike path with no rider. And then the sirens stopped. Not because help arrived, because the fire trucks ran out of water. I want you to sit with that for a second. The fire trucks ran out of water. In the middle of a neighborhood fire, in a developed American city, with hydrants on every block, the trucks ran dry. Firefighters were standing there with hoses and nothing was coming out. The hydrants had lost pressure because the municipal water system couldn't keep up with the demand. The pumps were overwhelmed. The reservoir upstream had been running low for months. This isn't a fringe scenario. This is what happened in Los Angeles in January 2025. This is what happened in Paradise, California. This is what happens when a water infrastructure built for normal conditions meets conditions that are no longer normal. And here's what nobody wants to say out loud. It's going to happen again. It's already happening in slow motion all across the American West. Lake Mead is sitting at less than a third of its capacity. The Colorado River, which supplies water to over 40 million people, is shrinking every single year. Phoenix, Las Vegas, Tucson, cities that millions of families call home, are operating under water restrictions that would have seemed unthinkable 20 years ago. The drought isn't coming. It's here. It's been here. And the system you're depending on to deliver water to your tap was not built for what's coming next. You're not paranoid for thinking about this. You're paying attention. I know who you are, because I was you not long ago. You're not a doomsday prepper. You don't have a bunker. You're not stockpiling canned goods in some remote cabin in Montana. You're a parent. Maybe you're a homeowner. You work hard. You pay your bills. You take care of your family. And somewhere in the back of your mind, there's a quiet, persistent worry that you can't quite shake what happens if the water stops. Not in some abstract apocalyptic sense, just practically. What happens if there's a boil water advisory for a week? What happens if your city announces emergency rationing? What happens if a wildfire gets close and the hydrants in your neighborhood run dry the same way they did in mine? You've probably thought about this and then pushed it aside, because thinking about it without having a real answer is just anxiety with nowhere to go. And most of the solutions people suggest are either too expensive, too complicated, or too dependent on conditions you can't control. You've heard about storing bottled water. Maybe you've even done it. You've got a few cases in the garage, a couple gallons under the sink. But do the math honestly. A family of 4 needs at minimum 12 gallons of water per day, and that's just for drinking and basic hygiene. To have even a 30-day supply, you'd need 360 gallons of bottled water. That's not a precaution. That's a warehouse, and that water has a shelf life. It leaches plastic into whatever it's stored in, and when it runs out, it runs out. You've maybe looked into rainwater collection. It sounds logical. It sounds sustainable. But if you live in the Southwest or most of the Mountain West, rain is the one thing you cannot count on. And in many states, including parts of California, collecting rainwater is either heavily regulated or outright restricted. The same government that can't keep your hydrants pressurized will fine you for catching rain off your own roof. Maybe you've looked into drilling a well, and then you saw the price tag anywhere from $12,000 to $20,000 for professional installation. Assuming you even have access to a viable aquifer, assuming the aquifer isn't already depleted or contaminated, and assuming your local water rights law actually allows you to use what you find. In most Western states, water rights belong to the state. You can drill a well and still have it shut down. Every solution that exists leads back to the same dead end. You're either dependent on a system that's failing, spending money you don't have on something that won't scale, or running up against laws designed to keep you dependent on the grid. I felt that frustration for years before the fire. I'd done the research. I'd hit every wall. And I'd mostly made peace with not having a real answer, which is its own kind of helplessness. Then a few months before the fire, something changed. I had an uncle. He spent years as a combat engineer in the Marine Corps. He did tours in Afghanistan, in Djibouti, in places he couldn't talk about. After he got back, he moved to a small property on the edge of some state land and mostly kept to himself. Off the grid in the real sense, no internet, shortwave radio, books. He said he didn't trust the infrastructure. I thought it was PTSD. Now I think he just knew things most people don't. He passed away unexpectedly. And before he went, he left something behind. What he left behind in the glove box of his Jeep, wrapped in plastic inside a worn manila envelope, were schematics, engineering diagrams, pages of notes in his handwriting, dense and technical, the kind of thing that takes weeks to decode if you don't have the background. At the bottom of the last page, circled twice, were 4 words: never let them thirst. It took me months to understand what I was looking at. The system he designed, or more accurately, adapted from technology already in use in places the public never thinks about, was an atmospheric water generator. A device that pulls moisture directly from the air and converts it into clean, drinkable water. No pipes. No municipal connection. No rain required. Just air, and a process that the Navy uses in submarines and NASA uses on the International Space Station. Scaled down and rebuilt for a residential garage. The concept isn't magic. It's physics. Air contains water vapor. When you cool that air below its dew point, the moisture condenses. That's what happens on a cold glass on a humid day. What my uncle's design did, and what took me weeks to fully grasp, was make that process efficient enough, and cheap enough, and simple enough that a person without an engineering degree could build it from parts available at any hardware store or salvage yard. I built my first version on a workbench in my garage with a borrowed drill, some aluminum tubing from an old refrigerator, a couple of salvaged computer fans, and a food-grade plastic barrel. It looked ridiculous. It looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie prop department. But it worked. The first time I held a cup under the output and watched water, clean, cold, real water, fill it up from nothing but the air in my garage, something shifted in me that I haven't been able to fully describe. It wasn't excitement exactly. It was something quieter than that. It was the feeling of a door closing behind you and realizing you don't need what was on the other side anymore. My system was producing a steady supply of clean water every single day by the time the fire came. Not enough to fill a swimming pool, but enough for drinking, cooking, and basic needs without touching the tap. Enough to matter. When the alerts came, we did what the system told us to do. We prepared to evacuate. But before we left, I turned on the system, and we soaked everything we could. The roof, the fence line, the exterior walls, the dry grass along the property line. We had water when nobody else did, and we used every minute of it before we got out. When we came back 2 days later, 3 houses on our block were gone. Ours was still standing. The firefighters who came through 2 days later, walking the damage assessment, stopped in front of my house and looked at it the way you look at something that doesn't make sense. One of them asked me how I still had water when the hydrants had been dry for hours. I told him I'd built something. He didn't ask what. I think he understood that some questions don't have simple answers. In the weeks after the fire, I started hearing from people. Neighbors, friends of friends, people I didn't know who'd heard the story through someone who knew someone. They all asked the same thing. How? How did you have water when nobody else did? How did you build something like that? How much did it cost? The honest answers are, I had access to information most people never find. I spent about $100 in parts, and I built it in a weekend. It won't stop a wildfire. But it gave my family water independence when the grid had nothing left to give. A retired mechanic in Tucson built his version using parts from an old dehumidifier and a window AC unit he found at a salvage yard. He told me his wife hadn't bought a case of bottled water in 6 months. A single mother in Texas built hers with her brother over 2 weekends. She told me she finally felt like she had control over something the city couldn't take away from her. A man in Idaho built 2 units, one for daily use, one sealed in a steel drum buried on his property. He called it insurance. A firefighter in Northern California adapted the design for his cabin and told me that during the last fire season, his truck kept pumping water after the department vehicles had to pull back. These aren't preppers. These aren't people who think the world is ending. These are people who looked at the gap between what the system promises and what it actually delivers, and decided they'd rather not be standing on the wrong side of that gap when it matters. I'm not selling anything in this video. I want to be clear about that. What I'm telling you about is a design, a concept, a category of solution that exists and works, and costs almost nothing compared to every other option you've been told to consider. If you want to go deeper, if you want the actual schematics, the parts list, the step-by-step build process, that information exists, and it's findable. The link in the description and in the pinned comment will take you there. It costs less than a tank of gas. But even if you never click that link, I want you to walk away from this video with one thing: the understanding that you are not as dependent on the grid as they want you to believe. The infrastructure that delivers water to your tap is aging, stressed, underfunded, and in many parts of this country already failing. The droughts are real. The fires are real. The pressure on municipal water systems is real, and it is getting worse. You have options that don't require a permit, don't require a contractor, and don't require you to ask anyone's permission. The technology exists. People are using it right now, quietly, in neighborhoods across the country, pulling clean water out of thin air while their neighbors worry about the next boil advisory. The question isn't whether this is real. The question is whether you're going to do something about it before you need to or after. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. That's all.